They call it an honor to be chosen for the sarcophagus, a privilege reserved for heroes too valuable to let die. They don't tell you that death would have been mercy, that the honor is a prison that will last centuries, that you'll spend most of your eternal existence screaming in darkness that no one can hear. If you want to understand the true cost of the Imperium's desperate fight for survival, subscribe to this channel as we explore what it really means to be entombed in a Dreadnought, the walking tomb that keeps you alive long after you should have been granted the Emperor's peace. Brother, Captain Titus Aethon died on the battlefields of Armageddon during the Third War for that hell world. A Chaos Terminator's power fist crushed his torso, pulverizing his organs and shattering his enhanced bones despite the protection of his artificer armor. His secondary heart exploded from the impact. His primary heart stopped 3 seconds later. His consciousness faded as blood filled his lungs, and his enhanced physiology finally encountered damage too catastrophic to repair. He should have died there, surrounded by the bodies of his battle brothers, his gene, seed recovered for implantation in a new aspirant who would carry on his legacy. His name would have been added to the chapter's roll of honor, his deeds remembered in the reclusium, his sacrifice mourned and celebrated by brothers who would fight in his name. That would have been a good death, a proper death, an ending worthy of a space marine who had served the Emperor faithfully for 237 years. Instead, he woke up. The first sensation was not pain, though pain came later, in quantities that redefined Titus's understanding of suffering. The first sensation was wrongness, a fundamental disconnect between what his consciousness expected and what his sensory inputs reported. He tried to open his eyes. Nothing happened. No eyelids responded to neural commands. No muscles contracted. No familiar sensation of light hitting photoreceptors. He tried to move his arms. Nothing. No proprioceptive feedback indicating limb position. No kinesthetic sense of movement or resistance. Just absence where his body should have been. He tried to breathe. His lungs. He had no lungs. Panic flooded through neural pathways that should have triggered adrenaline responses, should have increased heart rate and respiration, should have prepared his body for fight or flight. But there was no adrenaline because there were no glands to produce it. No heart rate because his hearts had been replaced by power cores. No respiration because his lungs were gone, excised, removed along with most of his organic body. He tried to scream. No throat, no vocal cords, no mouth. Just neural impulses firing into systems that translated thought into electronic signals, but provided no outlet for the primal terror that consciousness experiences when separated from the body it spent centuries inhabiting. This lasted for hours, days, possibly weeks. Time became immediately meaningless without circadian rhythms or proprioceptive feedback to anchor consciousness to physical reality. Titus existed in pure panic, consciousness aware of itself but unable to interact with anything external, trapped in solitary confinement inside his own mind. Then the voice came. "Brother, Captain Aethon, can you hear me? If you understand my words, activate the primary Vox link." The voice was familiar. Techmarine Hadrian, one of the chapter's machine, priests responsible for maintaining the sacred war, plate and weapons. But how was he hearing it? Where was the sound coming from? He had no ears, no auditory organs, no. Understanding crashed through his panic like a wrecking ball through rockcrete. He was receiving audio input through electronic sensors. His consciousness was interpreting electronic signals as sound. He was, "Brother, Captain, I know you're confused. I know you're afraid. But you need to focus. Find the connection in your thoughts that corresponds to speech. Imagine speaking, and the machine spirit will translate your neural impulses into Vox communication." Titus tried. Thought the words, "I hear you," with intention and focus, projecting them outward rather than keeping them internal. The attempt felt absurd, like trying to lift objects with pure willpower, but his own voice emerged from external speakers, mechanical and distorted but recognizably his. "I hear you." "Good. That's very good. Brother, Captain. Now I need you to remain calm while I explain what has happened to you. Hadrian's explanation was clinical, technical, delivered with the emotional detachment of a techmarine reciting specifications. Titus had been recovered from the battlefield, his body so catastrophically damaged that conventional medical intervention was impossible. But his gene seed was intact, his consciousness preserved, his value to the chapter too great to simply let him die. The decision had been made to entomb him. The process had required removing most of his organic body. His brain, or most of it. The parts that contained consciousness and memory had been extracted and placed in a life support sarcophagus. His spinal column had been retained where possible, the neural connections preserved. Everything else had been excised, replaced, or eliminated. His new body was a dreadnought, a walking war machine 12 feet tall and weighing several tons. His limbs were no longer flesh but adamantium and ceramite. His weapons were integrated directly into his frame. A twin, linked las cannon replacing his right arm, an assault cannon where his left arm used to be. Frag launchers mounted in his shoulders. His senses were no longer biological but electronic. Cameras provided visual input. Audio sensors supplied hearing. His proprioception now came from hundreds of position sensors throughout his mechanical frame, reporting the angle and stress on every joint, the tension on every hydraulic system. He was no longer really Titus Aethon, Space Marine. He was Titus Aethon, Venerable Dreadnought, a walking tomb, a mechanical immortal, a consciousness trapped in a prison of adamantium that would persist for centuries or millennia beyond any normal lifespan. The adjustment period is difficult. Hadrian explained with what might have been sympathy if tech marines were capable of such emotion. But you will adapt. All venerable brothers adapt eventually, and your service to the chapter will continue, your wisdom and experience preserved for future generations. Titus wanted to scream that he didn't want to adapt, that he wanted to die properly, that this wasn't honor but horror. But the words wouldn't form. Some part of him, the part that had been conditioned through centuries of indoctrination, that had been reshaped from human boy into space marine warrior, recognized that refusing this fate would be refusing service to the Emperor, and refusing service was unthinkable even in the face of endless suffering. So instead he asked, "How long?" "How long what?" "Brother, Captain. How long has it been since Armageddon? Since I died? 7 months, 3 weeks, and 5 days. The surgery and integration process was extensive, but you're fully operational now. Within a few weeks, you'll be ready for combat deployment. 7 months. 7 months he had been dead and hadn't known it. 7 months his consciousness had been trapped in this sarcophagus, while tech marines and apothecaries dissected his body and rebuilt him as a machine. The panic returned, stronger than before. He had been robbed of death, stolen from the peace of the Emperor's side, imprisoned in metal and forced to continue fighting in wars that would never end because he could no longer die properly. Every battle would be survived. Every wound would be repaired. The only release would be complete destruction of his sarcophagus, and the chapter would do everything possible to prevent that because he was too valuable to lose. He was immortal, and immortality was a curse beyond any he had imagined. The first weeks were torture of a kind that chaos couldn't match because it was inflicted with benevolent intentions. The tech marines ran constant diagnostics, tested his neural connections, calibrated his sensors and weapons systems. Each test was a new experience in dissociation between consciousness and physical form. They would activate his visual sensors, and he would suddenly perceive the world from a perspective 12 feet above where his brain told him his eyes should be. They would move his limbs, massive mechanical arms that weighed hundreds of pounds each, and his mind would expect resistance and weight that no longer existed because his consciousness was still calibrated for a body that no longer existed. They would fire his weapons, and the recoil would transmit through his frame in ways that his hindbrain interpreted as injury, even though no damage was occurring. His consciousness had spent 2 centuries learning that sudden violent impacts meant wounds that needed healing. Now those same neural pathways were firing in response to normal combat operations, creating phantom pain that had no source but felt absolutely real. Worst were the phantom limbs. His brain kept insisting his arms were still there, still flesh and bone, still capable of fine manipulation. He would try to pick up a data, slate, or make the sign of the Aquila, and his consciousness would expect fingers to close and wrists to rotate. But instead, massive adamantium claws would activate, crushing whatever he was trying to grasp or simply swinging through space where his biological arms should have been. The frustration was maddening. Simple tasks he had performed without thought for 2 centuries suddenly required intense concentration and produced clumsy results. His hands had been capable of field, stripping a bolter in 30 seconds in complete darkness. Now his claws couldn't hold a bolter at all without crushing it. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't feel the satisfaction of a meal after combat or the ritual of breaking bread with his battle brothers. His nutrients came through tubes that fed directly into his preserved brain tissue, flavorless compounds that sustained biological function without providing any of the sensory feedback that made eating meaningful. He couldn't sleep properly. Dreadnoughts were placed in stasis between battles, consciousness suspended in a state that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite death. It was more like being turned off, awareness ceasing, and then resuming without any sense of time passing. No dreams, no rest. Just cessation of consciousness and then sudden reactivation. And he couldn't feel, couldn't experience touch or temperature or texture. His sensors reported temperature differentials and pressure changes, translated these into data that his consciousness could interpret. But it wasn't the same as feeling. It was knowing intellectually that something was hot or cold or rough, but not experiencing the sensation directly. This might have been the worst loss. Space Marines were warriors, yes, but they were also brothers. They shared touch in ways baseline humans didn't, the casual physical contact of warriors who trusted each other completely. A hand on the shoulder after a difficult battle, the clasp of forearms in greeting, the weight of armor pressed against armor in the tight confines of a drop pod, all gone. Titus was isolated inside his sarcophagus, unable to touch or be touched, his only physical interactions mediated through tons of metal that registered pressure as data rather than sensation. The loneliness was crushing, more crushing than the actual weight of his frame, which his consciousness couldn't feel, but knew intellectually was enormous. He was surrounded by his battle brothers, but separated from them by barriers that couldn't be crossed. They could speak to him through Vox links, but they couldn't reach him. He could perceive them through cameras, but he couldn't see them the way he used to, with eyes that tracked subtle expressions and body language. He was already becoming other, transitioning from brother to relic, from warrior to walking memorial. His battle brothers treated him with respect that bordered on reverence, spoke to him with deference that felt wrong because he was still just Titus, still the same consciousness that had fought beside them for decades. Except he wasn't. He was changing not by choice but by necessity. His consciousness was adapting to its new reality, neural pathways reorganizing around electronic senses rather than biological ones. The Titus who had been was dying gradually, replaced by something that retained his memories and identity but experienced existence in fundamentally different ways. The first combat deployment came 3 weeks after his awakening. A chaos incursion on the Agony, world of Demeter's Hope, Black Legion forces attempting to establish a foothold for larger invasion. Titus's company was deployed to eliminate the threat before it could spread beyond the initial landing sites. Loading into the Thunderhawk was the first indication of how much had changed. Previously, Titus had walked into the transport on his own, secured himself in the crash webbing, and spent the descent in meditation or prayer. Now he was loaded like cargo, his massive frame secured with heavy chains and mag clamps, unable to even shift position during the flight. He could see his battle brothers through his optical sensors, see them checking weapons and reciting prayers, their pre-combat rituals familiar and painful to observe from outside. He tried to join them in prayer, vocalizing the litany of hate through his external speakers, but his mechanical voice transformed the sacred words into something that sounded wrong, hollow, robotic rather than human. His brothers didn't comment, but he could see, through cameras that tracked facial expressions in ways his biological eyes never had. The subtle flinches when his speakers activated, the involuntary discomfort that came from hearing a machine voice reciting prayers meant for living throats. The descent was agony. His sensors detected every vibration of atmospheric entry, every adjustment of the Thunderhawk's engines, every shift in trajectory. His consciousness interpreted these sensations as turbulence far worse than it actually was, his hindbrain insisting that impacts this severe meant his body was being damaged even though his armor was functioning perfectly. The deployment was worse. The Thunderhawk's rear ramp dropped and his battle brothers disembarked with practiced efficiency, but Titus required assistance. Tech Marines operated the loading crane that lifted his multi-ton frame and swung him out of the transport, lowering him to the ground with mechanical precision that felt nothing like the autonomy of walking on his own legs. His feet, massive armored plates that served as his base, contacted the soil of Demeter's Hope, and his weight sank 6 inches into the ground immediately. His frame was too heavy for normal terrain. Each step left craters, his passage obvious to any enemy with functioning eyes. He tried to move, and his consciousness expected the familiar rhythm of walking, the alternating pattern of left foot, right foot that he had performed billions of times over 2 centuries. But his legs were no longer legs in any biological sense. They were hydraulic pillars that required conscious control of systems that had been automatic for his entire previous existence. His first step was a stumbling lurch that nearly toppled him. His gyroscope screamed warnings that he was off balance. His tactical systems warned that falling would leave him vulnerable to enemy fire. He corrected desperately, firing his stabilization jets, systems he hadn't known he possessed until that moment, and managed to remain upright. His battle brothers were already advancing, moving across the battlefield with the fluid coordination of a unit that had fought together for decades. Titus tried to follow and managed a graceless, stomping gait that was less walking and more controlled falling forward, each step a separate achievement rather than part of an automatic pattern. The enemy appeared as his sensors detected movement at the tree line 600 meters distant. Black Legion Chaos Space Marines, corrupted versions of what Titus himself had once been, emerged from cover and opened fire with bolters and plasma weapons. Titus's tactical systems, installed by the Tech Marines and integrated directly into his consciousness, immediately identified targets, calculated firing solutions, prioritized threats by their assessed danger levels. The information flooded his awareness in ways his biological senses never had, overwhelming his consciousness with data that he didn't know how to process. Red targeting reticles appeared in his vision, overlaying his view of the battlefield with information about range, wind speed, ammunition counts, weapon heat levels. His consciousness tried to focus on the enemies themselves, but kept getting distracted by the cascade of tactical data that his systems insisted was important. "Venerable brother," Captain Hadrian's voice crackled through his Vox link. "Engage targets at your discretion. Provide fire support while we advance. Engage." Right? Titus tried to raise his weapons and found that the simple act of aiming required controlling dozens of systems simultaneously. His shoulder joints needed to rotate to specific angles. His torso needed to traverse to align his weapon axis with the target. His targeting systems needed to account for ammunition trajectory and travel time. His power core needed to route sufficient energy to the weapon systems to sustain fire. All of this had to happen consciously. His biological body would have aimed and fired without thinking, muscle memory, and enhanced reflexes handling the mechanical details, while his consciousness focused on tactics and target selection. Now every action required deliberate thought, forced him to be aware of the mechanical processes that produced the desired result. He finally achieved target lock on a Chaos Marine at 500 meters. His assault cannon was loaded and energized. His firing solutions were optimal. He activated the weapon system with a thought, command and. The cannon roared to life, spewing hundreds of high, explosive rounds downrange at a rate that would have been impossible for any hand-held weapon. The recoil transmitted through his frame in ways his consciousness interpreted as violent impacts, phantom pain shooting through limbs that no longer existed. His targeting systems tracked the round's trajectory, showing him through his optical sensors as they impacted the Chaos Marine and literally tore him apart. The kill should have felt satisfying, should have triggered the combat euphoria that Space Marines experienced when defeating enemies of the Emperor. But all Titus felt was detached observation, awareness that his weapons had functioned correctly and eliminated a threat, data points in a tactical assessment rather than visceral experience of combat. He engaged more targets, his assault cannon tracking and firing with mechanical precision. His last cannon added its coherent light to the battle, punching through corrupted armor and vaporizing the traitors within. His frag launchers scattered explosives across enemy positions, clearing approach routes for his advancing battle brothers. From a tactical perspective, his intervention was decisive. His firepower exceeded what an entire tactical squad could bring to bear. His armor survived direct hits from plasma weapons that would have killed a normal Space Marine instantly. His sensors provided battlefield awareness that helped coordinate the company's assault. But from a subjective experiential perspective, he wasn't fighting. He was operating a weapon platform, controlling a machine that happened to contain his consciousness. The visceral immediacy of combat, the rush of adrenaline, the physical exertion, the sensory overload of being in close quarters with enemies trying to kill you. All of it was absent, replaced by clinical observation of tactical data and systems management. The battle ended within 20 minutes. The Black Legion forces were eliminated, their beachhead destroyed, the threat to Demeter's hope neutralized. Titus's battle, brothers gathered around him, congratulating him on his performance, praising his accuracy and firepower. He received their words through audio sensors and struggled to feel anything about them. He had done his duty. He had served the Emperor. He had destroyed enemies of humanity. These were good things, objectively speaking. But he felt nothing, no satisfaction, no pride, no sense of accomplishment. Just awareness that he had performed assigned functions adequately and would be expected to do so again in the next after battle, and the battle after that, and every battle for centuries or millennia to come. This was what his existence would be now. Endless repetition of mechanical actions, consciousness trapped in a machine, serving purposes he believed in, but couldn't connect to emotionally because all the physical and psychological feedback loops that made service meaningful had been severed when his body was taken from him. They returned him to the strike cruiser and placed him in stasis, his consciousness simply ceasing without warning or transition. When he was reactivated for the next battle, no time seemed to have passed, even though his internal chronometer reported 3 months had elapsed. 3 months gone in an instant. 3 months his brothers had lived through, had experienced, had used to grow and develop and form memories. 3 months Titus had simply skipped, turned off like a machine because that's what he was now. The pattern repeated. Wake for battle. Fight with mechanical precision. Return to stasis. Wake for battle. Over and over, battles blurring together because there was no life between them, no downtime or rest or recovery, just combat and then void and then combat again. Years passed this way. Decades. Titus's battle brothers aged around him, those who survived gaining scars and experience while he remained unchanged except for cosmetic damage to his frame that was repaired between battles. He watched friends die and be replaced by new brothers he barely had time to know before they too fell and were replaced. He became a constant in a chapter of mortals. Brothers would join the company as raw scouts and leave as grizzled veterans while Titus remained exactly as he was, measuring time not in years but in battles, his consciousness skipping forward through subjective decades that felt like months. The loneliness was worse than any physical pain the chaos could inflict. He was surrounded by brothers, but separated from them by centuries of subjective time differential. A battle. Brother, he remembered as a fresh initiate would return from stasis as a scarred veteran with decades of experiences Titus had missed because he'd been turned off between battles. He tried to maintain connections, tried to be present for his brothers between battles when he was awakened for ceremonies or training exercises. But the relationships felt increasingly hollow, artificial, maintained through effort rather than natural development. How do you form meaningful bonds when every interaction feels like the first one? Because months or years have passed between them. How do you be a brother when you can't share meals or rest, or the casual intimacy of warriors living together? How do you maintain your humanity when your human experiences become increasingly distant memories compared to the eternal present of mechanical existence? His consciousness began to change in ways he couldn't prevent or control. Memories of his biological life started feeling dreamlike, uncertain, possibly false. Had he really once walked on legs made of flesh? Had he truly possessed hands capable of fine manipulation? Had there been a time when he could taste food and feel the warmth of another body in close contact? The memories claimed yes, but they felt increasingly fictional, stories his consciousness told itself about a person who might never have existed. His real existence, the only existence that felt immediate and concrete, was this consciousness in a sarcophagus, perceiving through electronic sensors, acting through mechanical systems, serving through combat and stasis and combat again. Brother Medica Artem visited him during one of his waking periods, conducting the psychological evaluations required for all venerable brothers. The Medici was young. Though everyone was young compared to Titus now, even the chapter master hadn't been alive as long as Titus had been entombed. "How are you feeling, venerable brother?" The question was ritual, asked of all dreadnoughts, usually answered with ritual responses about readiness to serve. Titus found himself giving an honest response instead. "I feel dead, brother. I feel like I died on Armageddon 3 centuries ago, and my consciousness simply hasn't realized it yet." Artem was silent for a moment, his young face showing concern that was probably genuine even if it couldn't help. "Your service honors the Emperor and the chapter, venerable brother. Your wisdom and experience." "I have no wisdom," Titus interrupted, his mechanical voice flat and cold. "I have data. I have tactical assessments. I have combat statistics from 6,000 battles. But wisdom requires contemplation, requires experience processed through time spent in reflection. I have no time. I have battles separated by void. I have consciousness turned on for minutes or hours and then turned off for months or years. How does that produce wisdom?" The other venerable brothers. "As trapped as I am. Do you know how many dreadnoughts we have in the chapter? 17. Do you know how many of those 17 still communicate regularly with our brothers? 3. The rest have retreated so far into themselves that they barely acknowledge the external world between battles. They wake, they fight, they return to stasis without engaging with anything else, because engaging requires maintaining continuity of consciousness and experience that we don't have." Artem had no response to that. What could he say? That it would get better. It wouldn't. That Titus would adjust. He had adjusted, and the adjustment was itself a kind of death, consciousness changing to accommodate eternal imprisonment until it became something that could accept the unacceptable. "I'm sorry, venerable brother," Artem finally said, and his sincerity was obvious even through Titus's electronic sensors. "Your sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice if it wasn't chosen. Sacrifice requires agency, requires decision. I was never asked if I wanted this. I woke up entombed and was told it was an honor. Maybe it is. Maybe I should be grateful that the chapter valued me enough to preserve my consciousness instead of letting me die properly. But gratitude requires feeling, and I'm not sure I remember how to feel anything except observational awareness of my own continued existence. The conversation ended awkwardly. Artem departed after making notes in his data slate, probably documenting that venerable brother Titus was experiencing psychological distress consistent with extended Dreadnought service. Nothing would change as a result. Titus would continue being awakened for battle and returned to stasis between deployments until his sarcophagus was finally destroyed by enemies or catastrophic failure. The centuries continued their slow grinding progression. Titus served in battle after battle, his combat performance remaining excellent even as his connection to the experiences faded further. He became an autopilot, consciousness monitoring systems and executing combat protocols without emotional investment in the outcomes. He watched the chapter change around him. Traditions evolved, tactics adapted to new enemies, technology improved incrementally, but Titus remained frozen, a constant that made everything else's change more obvious by contrast. He became a relic in ways that went beyond the honorific, venerable. He was a living piece of the chapter's history, his existence spanning periods that were historical to current brothers. He had fought in battles they studied as tactical examples. He remembered chapter masters they knew only from paintings in the Reclusium. He should have been proud of this continuity, this service extending across centuries. Instead, he felt like a ghost haunting the chapter, a consciousness that had outlived its proper span and now persisted through institutional inertia rather than any meaningful purpose. The worst moments came during ceremonies honoring the fallen. His battle brothers would gather to remember those who had died heroically in service to the Emperor, would speak their names and recount their deeds, would celebrate lives spent in righteous war. And Titus would observe through his sensors, unable to participate properly because he couldn't die heroically, couldn't spend his life in service because his life had already been spent and then forcibly extended, couldn't find glory in death because death had been taken from him. He envied the fallen, envied them their clean endings, their proper conclusions, their transformation from living warriors into honored memories. They got to die and be remembered. He had to persist and be forgotten, his continued existence making him familiar and therefore unremarkable, his ancient service taken for granted because it just kept going. Sometimes during battles, he would make decisions that weren't entirely optimal, would take risks that increased the chance of catastrophic damage to his sarcophagus. Not deliberately seeking destruction, that would be abandoning his duty, but not trying as hard as he could to avoid it either. None of these risks resulted in his annihilation. His armor was too strong, his weapons too powerful, his tactical programming too effective. He survived everything, accumulated thousands more kills, continued existing beyond any reasonable span. He met other Dreadnoughts occasionally, ancient brothers from other chapters who had also been entombed for centuries or millennia. They would communicate during joint operations, their mechanical voices exchanging data about tactical situations and combat efficiency. Some of them had adapted better than Titus, had found ways to accept their existence and maintain something approaching contentment. They spoke of their service with genuine pride, of the satisfaction they took in continuing to fight for the Emperor across spans of time that would terrify normal humans. Others had retreated so far into themselves that communication was barely possible. They would respond to tactical commands, but showed no personality, no individual consciousness behind their mechanical voices. They had become what Titus feared becoming, machines that happened to run on preserved brain tissue rather than cogitators, functionally no different from the AI that the Imperium feared and forbidden. Titus existed somewhere between these extremes. Not content but not catatonic, Not proud but not despairing. Just continuing existing, serving, measuring time in battles and centuries, and endless repetition of mechanical existence. He tried to find meaning in small things. The efficiency of a perfect weapons solution. The satisfaction of protecting his battle, brothers with covering fire. The beauty of battlefield tactics executed flawlessly. These were thin threads of connection to purpose, barely enough to maintain psychological coherence, but they were all he had. His consciousness continued to change. His memories of biological existence faded to the point where he could barely remember what it felt like to have a body, to eat food, to experience touch. His present reality, electronic sensors, mechanical actuators, combat protocols, became his entire frame of reference. He was becoming machine, not through corruption of the flesh like the Mechanicus pursued, but through simple attrition of organic consciousness in an inorganic existence. Every battle made him slightly more efficient and slightly less himself. Every return to stasis erased a little more of what made him an individual rather than a weapon system. And through it all, the central horror persisted. He couldn't die, couldn't find rest, couldn't stop serving the honor they had given him. Preservation of his consciousness, extension of his service, was a trap that would last until the heat death of the universe or the end of the Imperium, whichever came first. This was immortality, not the glorious eternal life promised by religious traditions, but grinding continuation of consciousness in circumstances that made death seem like paradise. Not transcendence, but imprisonment. Not reward, but punishment extending across centuries and possibly millennia. The Imperium needed its dreadnoughts, needed the experience and combat power they provided, needed the continuity they offered to chapters that lost brothers constantly. The strategic value was undeniable, the military necessity clear. But the cost was never mentioned in the ceremonies, never acknowledged in the honor bestowed, never discussed with the aspirants who dreamed of becoming space marines and serving the Emperor in glorious combat. They were taught that death in service was the highest achievement, that sacrifice was noble, that spending one's life for the Emperor's realm was the ultimate expression of devotion. They were never told that sometimes the Imperium wouldn't let you die, that your consciousness could be trapped in a walking tomb and forced to continue serving long after your life should have ended. That honor could be indistinguishable from horror, that preservation could mean damnation, that the gift of immortality was actually a curse beyond imagination. Titus existed in this state for 640, 7 years from the date of his entombment. 640, 7 years of consciousness turned on and off, of battles separated by void, of watching generations live and die while he persisted unchanging. His end came finally on the daemon world of Vorath Prime, where his company was deployed to destroy a cult that threatened an entire sub-sector. The battle was brutal, the enemy cunning, the casualties heavy. Titus fought as he had fought for 6 centuries, his weapons systems eliminating threats with mechanical precision, his tactical protocols optimizing his company's combat effectiveness. A daemon prince manifested during the battle's climax, a creature of such power that conventional weapons were useless against its warp, strengthened hide. It tore through Titus's battle, brothers with contemptuous ease, slaughtering space marines who had no defense against its unholy strength. Titus engaged with everything he had. Lascannon, assault cannon, frag launchers, all firing in coordinated salvo that would have destroyed any mortal enemy. The daemon prince weathered the storm and closed to melee range, its massive claws reaching for Titus's sarcophagus with clear intent. For the first time in 647 years, Titus felt genuine emotion flood through his consciousness. Hope. Hope that this would be the end, that his imprisonment would finally terminate, that he would find the peace that had been denied him for so long. He didn't retreat, didn't seek support from his battle brothers, didn't employ any of the tactical protocols that might have allowed him to disengage safely. Instead, he stood his ground, firing until his weapons ran dry, accepting the Daemon Prince's attack without resistance. The creature's claws punched through his frontal armor like it was paper. Its warp, tainted strength tore into his sarcophagus, breaching the life support systems that had sustained his consciousness for 6 centuries. Alarms screamed through Titus's awareness as critical systems failed, as his preserved brain tissue was exposed to the Daemon world's corrupted atmosphere. His consciousness began to fragment, neural pathways shutting down as oxygen deprivation and trauma overwhelmed even his enhanced biology. His sensory inputs degraded to static. His tactical systems through cascading errors. His connection to his mechanical frame severed completely. And through it all, Titus felt something he hadn't experienced in 647 years: relief. His final thought, before consciousness finally ceased, was gratitude. Gratitude that it was over, that the endless continuation was ending, that death, real, final, permanent death, was claiming him at last. The Imperium would call his end a heroic sacrifice, would add his name to the roll of honor, would speak of his service across 7 centuries as exemplary devotion to the Emperor. They would be right, in their way. He had served faithfully, had killed enemies beyond counting, had protected his brothers through impossible odds. But the truth that would never be recorded in official histories, was simpler and darker. Titus Aethon had died on Armageddon during the Third War for that hell world. Everything that came after was just his consciousness taking 647 years to finish dying, trapped in a tomb that wouldn't let him rest, serving an Imperium that valued his combat effectiveness more than his suffering. This is what it really means to be entombed in a Dreadnought. This is the cost that's never mentioned when they speak of honor and preservation. This is why, when you see those massive armored forms striding across battlefields, you should feel not inspiration but horror at the consciousness trapped inside, at the immortality that's actually eternal imprisonment, at the service that continues long after death should have brought mercy. The Imperium needs its Dreadnoughts, but the Dreadnoughts didn't need this existence, didn't choose this fate, didn't want to serve for centuries when their natural span should have ended properly. They call it honor. But from inside the sarcophagus, trapped in metal and wired to machines, consciousness persisting when it should have ended, it feels like damnation. And the worst part is knowing it will continue. For you, for every other venerable brother, for every space marine who falls but doesn't die quite enough, until catastrophic failure or enemy action finally grants the mercy that should have come centuries ago. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even death isn't guaranteed. Sometimes the Imperium's need for warriors exceeds its mercy, and consciousness persists in prisons of metal, serving forever because forever is what the Emperor requires. And if you're very unlucky, if you're too valuable or too skilled or simply in the wrong place when your body fails, they'll decide that your consciousness is worth preserving. And then you'll discover what Titus learned, that honor is sometimes indistinguishable from horror, that immortality is a curse wearing the mask of a blessing, that service without end is just another word for damnation. The chapter recovered Titus's sarcophagus from Vorath Prime, extracted what remained of his gene seed, and added his name to the Reclusium's roll of honor with appropriate ceremony. They spoke of his centuries of faithful service, of the thousands of enemies he had slain, of the wisdom he had shared with generations of battle brothers. They didn't speak of the loneliness, or the dissociation, or the slow death of personality that occurred when consciousness was trapped in metal for centuries. They didn't mention how many times Titus had stood at the edge of tactical protocols that might have gotten him destroyed, or how his final stand against the Daemon Prince had been less heroic last stand and more desperate suicide by enemy action. These truths weren't useful to the chapter's purposes. Better to maintain the narrative of glorious service, of honored elders preserved to fight forever, of consciousness extended as reward for exceptional valor. Better not to examine too closely what that preservation actually meant for the consciousness being preserved. But across the Imperium, in fortress, monasteries, and strike cruisers and ancient battaliarchs, other dreadnoughts wake to serve. Other consciousnesses trapped in metal experience the same isolation, the same dissociation, the same slow erosion of self that Titus endured. Some adapt better, find ways to maintain psychological coherence across centuries of intermittent activation, develop coping mechanisms that allow them to accept their existence without despair. These are the ones the chapter points to as examples, as proof that entombment is sustainable. They don't talk about the others. The venerable brothers who wake screaming through their external speakers, consciousness fragmented by centuries of existence, it was never designed to endure. The ancient warriors who no longer respond to anything except direct combat commands, personality eroded away until only tactical programming remains. The dreadnoughts who have to be deactivated permanently because their consciousness has become so unstable that they're dangerous even to their own brothers. These failures are buried in classified records, hidden from aspirants who might question whether the honor is worth the cost. Brother Hadrian, the tech marine who had explained Titus's situation when he first woke Entombed, eventually became master of the forge for the chapter. He oversaw the maintenance and activation of all the chapter's dreadnoughts, spoke with each venerable brother before and after combat deployments, monitored their psychological states as best anyone could when consciousness was trapped behind adamantium and connected to reality only through electronic sensors. He had his own thoughts about the practice, thoughts he never voiced officially because they would constitute questioning chapter, tradition, and potentially heretical doubt about the emperor's will. But in private moments, reviewing the psychological assessments and watching ancient warriors struggle with existence they hadn't chosen, he wondered whether the Imperium's desperate need for experienced warriors justified this particular cost. He remembered Titus's words from centuries ago. It's not a sacrifice if it wasn't chosen. The Imperium runs on sacrifice. Billions die daily in service to humanity's survival. Their lives spent without hesitation or regret because the alternative is extinction. This sacrifice is necessary, justifiable, perhaps even noble in its absolute commitment to species survival. But sacrifice requires agency, requires choice, even if the choice is between bad options. The guardsman charging into certain death chooses to serve. The space marine accepting fatal wounds to protect his brothers chooses his end. Even the servitor, lobotomized and repurposed, existed as a criminal who made choices that led to that fate. The dreadnought never chooses. Consciousness returns to find the choice has already been made, the body already removed, the existence already determined. There is no opting out, no alternative offered, no ability to say, "Thank you for the honor, but I would prefer to die properly." Hadrian sometimes wondered what would happen if they did offer the choice, if they woke the dying space marine before surgery and asked, "Brother, your body is destroyed beyond recovery. We can let you die with honor, recovering your gene, seed for future generations. Or we can preserve your consciousness in a dreadnought, extending your service across centuries at cost of everything that makes you who you are." Which do you choose? How many would choose entombment if given honest assessment of what it meant? How many would accept immortality if they understood it was really imprisonment? How many would embrace eternal service if they knew it included centuries of loneliness, dissociation, and slow erasure of personality? He suspected the answer was very few, which was probably why the choice was never offered. The practice continued because the Imperium needed it to continue. Dreadnoughts were too valuable as combat assets, too useful as mobile weapons platforms, too important as carriers of institutional memory. The strategic benefits outweighed the costs to individual consciousness, especially when that cost could be hidden behind rhetoric about honor and glorious service. This was the calculus of the Imperium, individual suffering measured against collective survival, Personal agency sacrificed for strategic necessity. Consciousness imprisoned because letting it die would waste valuable combat experience. It was efficient. It was logical. It was monstrous. And it was necessary, or so they told themselves. The Imperium faced extinction from 1,000 directions simultaneously. Every resource had to be leveraged completely, every advantage exploited fully, every potential contribution extracted regardless of personal cost. In that context, what was the suffering of consciousness trapped in metal compared to the survival of humanity itself? What was individual agency compared to the Emperor's great work? What was one Space Marine's prolonged existence compared to the billions his continued service might save? The math made sense. The logic was impeccable. The horror was just a detail to be managed rather than a fundamental problem to be solved. Years after Titus's death, a young aspirant named Marcus survived the implantation process and began his training as a scout in the chapter's 10th company. He was bright, dedicated, physically capable beyond even normal Space Marine standards. His instructors marked him as a future leader, someone who might someday command a company or even rise to chapter master. During his training, Marcus spent time in the Reclusium studying the chapter's history and honoring the fallen. He learned the names of ancient heroes, studied their tactics and decisions, tried to understand what made them exceptional enough to be remembered across centuries. He also learned about the venerable brothers, the Dreadnoughts who served the chapter across impossible spans of time. The chaplains spoke of them with reverence, described their preservation as the highest honor the chapter could bestow, presented entombment as reward for exceptional service. Marcus listened and tried to feel inspired, tried to imagine his own consciousness preserved for centuries, his service extended beyond normal biological limits, his wisdom available to guide future generations. He mostly felt terror. The thought of existence trapped in metal, consciousness separated from body, centuries passing in intermittent activation between battles. It sounded less like honor and more like nightmare. But he kept these thoughts private because expressing doubt about chapter traditions was dangerous, could mark you as weak or unsuitable for the holy work of the Emperor's Angels of Death. So he nodded when the chaplain spoke of glory and honor, vocalized appropriate reverence for the venerable brothers, studied their tactical achievements, and incorporated their lessons into his own developing combat philosophy. And privately, in the depths of his enhanced consciousness, he prayed to the Emperor that he would die properly when his time came. That his body would fail completely. Seed recovered, but consciousness allowed to end. That he would be spared the honor of preservation, the glory of entombment, the immortality that looked increasingly like eternal imprisonment the more he learned about it. His prayers went unrecorded, shared with no one, buried beneath the layers of conditioning and indoctrination that transformed human boys into Space Marine warriors. He would serve faithfully regardless of what happened, because service was what he had been made for and what the Emperor required. But in his secret heart, he hoped desperately that service would end properly when the time came. This was the hidden truth at the core of the chapter, the unspoken understanding that everyone avoided examining too closely. That the honor they spoke of so reverently was built on suffering they refused to acknowledge. That the glory of the Dreadnoughts required continuous horror for the consciousness entombed within. That immortality was a curse that no one would choose if given honest choice. The institution required this dishonesty, required maintaining the narrative that preservation was reward, that extended service was blessing, that consciousness trapped in metal was somehow fulfilling its highest purpose. Because if they admitted the truth, that entombment was torture, that immortality was imprisonment, that the venerable brothers suffered continuously for the chapter's strategic benefit, then the whole practice would become impossible to justify. So they lied, beautifully, eloquently, with absolute conviction. Lied to the aspirants about what might await them, lied to the dying about what preservation would mean, lied to themselves about whether the strategic benefits justified the individual costs. And the Dreadnoughts, those still capable of communication, still retaining enough personality to express thoughts beyond tactical assessments, maintained the lie, because exposing it would mean admitting that their suffering was meaningless, that their centuries of service had been extraction of value from imprisoned consciousness rather than glorious eternal combat. Better to accept the narrative. Better to believe the lie. Better to tell yourself that the honor was real, the glory was genuine, the service was fulfilling even when experienced through electronic sensors in a body made of adamantium. Because the alternative, accepting that you were suffering pointlessly, that your consciousness had been trapped for strategic convenience, that the Emperor's great work required your eternal imprisonment, was psychologically devastating in ways that even space marine conditioning couldn't fully compensate for. So the cycle continued. Space Marines fell in battle, their bodies catastrophically damaged but gene, seed intact. Apothecaries assessed whether preservation was viable. Tech Marines performed the surgery, extracting brain and spine, installing consciousness in metal. The awakening, the horror, the slow adaptation or retreat into catatonia. And always, always the presentation of this as honor rather than horror, as glorious service rather than imprisonment, as the Emperor's blessing rather than humanity's desperate compromise between military necessity and basic compassion. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even death is a privilege that can be denied. Even ending can be prevented if your consciousness is deemed too valuable to lose. Even eternal rest can be replaced with eternal service in a walking tomb that will preserve you long past when you should have been granted peace. They call it honor. The Dreadnoughts trapped inside know better. They know it's imprisonment, suffering, isolation, and slow erosion of everything that made them individuals rather than weapons. But they serve anyway, because that's what Space Marines do. Serve despite cost. Fight despite suffering. Continue despite wanting nothing more than the ending that keeps being denied them. This is what it really feels like to be entombed in a Dreadnought. Not the glory the Imperium speaks of, but the horror it hides. Not the honor they promise, but the agony they inflict. Not the blessing of extended service, but the curse of immortality enforced on consciousness that should have been allowed to rest. Every time you see a Dreadnought on the battlefield, its massive form striding through enemy fire, its weapons reducing foes to ash and vapor, its ancient hull bearing the scars of centuries of combat, remember that inside that walking tomb is a consciousness that wanted to die, that earned death through service, that was denied that death because the Imperium needed its experience more than it respected its agency. Remember that the Venerable Brother's service is not entirely voluntary, that its extension across centuries is not entirely willing, that the honor bestowed is also horror inflicted. Remember that immortality is not always blessing, that preservation is not always mercy, that service without end is just another form of damnation. And if you're very unlucky, if you prove too valuable or too skilled or simply die in ways that leave your brain intact, you might discover this truth firsthand, might wake in darkness and metal, consciousness trapped in a sarcophagus, awareness of your own entombment flooding through circuits and sensors that replace the body you'll never have again, might spend centuries serving in a prison of honor, fighting in a walking tomb, existing in immortality that feels like death would be preferable, might learn, as Titus learned, that the agony of immortality is real, that eternal service is really eternal suffering, that the glory the Imperium promises is built on horror it refuses to acknowledge. This is the truth they don't tell aspirants, the cost they hide from candidates, the reality they obscure behind ritual and rhetoric and carefully maintained lies about honor and sacrifice. The Dreadnoughts know. They live it, endure it, suffer through it for centuries. And they can't even warn others because exposing the truth would undermine the institution, would reveal that the Emperor's great work requires this particular atrocity, would force everyone to confront whether survival justifies this cost. So they stay silent or maintain the lie or retreat so far into themselves that communication becomes impossible. And the next generation learns the same lessons, makes the same discoveries, endures the same suffering. Forever and forever. As long as the Imperium endures, as long as humanity needs warriors, as long as consciousness can be preserved in metal and forced to serve beyond its natural span. The agony of immortality, experienced in walking tombs across the galaxy by thousands of consciousness that earned death but were denied it, that wanted rest but were given eternal service, that deserved peace but received only continuation in circumstances that make peace impossible. This is what it feels like to be entombed in a dreadnought. This is the cost the Imperium won't acknowledge. This is the horror hiding behind the honor, and it continues, day after day, battle after battle, century after century, because the alternative, letting valuable consciousness die properly, is a luxury the Imperium can't afford. So the dreadnoughts serve, and suffer, and endure, and die too slowly across spans of time that mock any natural lifespan, in bodies that aren't bodies, experiencing existence that barely qualifies as living, immortal, imprisoned, horrified. This is their reality. This is their service. This is their sacrifice, though calling it sacrifice implies choice they never had. Remember them when you see those massive forms on battlefields. Remember what's trapped inside the metal. Remember the consciousness that wanted to rest and was denied. Remember the cost the Imperium extracts from its greatest warriors. And pray you never prove valuable enough to be preserved. Because that honor, that terrible, inescapable honor, is worse than any death.